Dante Salvator was drunk for the first time in 6 years when he showed up at her door. His offer was simple: fix the broken watch, stay under his protection for 72 hours, and walk away with enough money to save her dead father's shop. 72 hours, one watch. One promise that no one would touch her while she was in his house. Her rules were simpler: no lies, no locked doors, and no blood on her workbench. But before the third night was over, neither of them would keep their rules. Because Elena Rossi didn't know the gold watch in her hands had once ticked against a dead girl's wrist. She didn't know the man standing in her doorway smelling like whiskey and rain had built an empire out of grief and called it discipline. She only knew he was bleeding through a black dress shirt, swaying under the weak hall light and looking at her as if asking for help had cost him a piece of bone. And the worst part was this: when he said, "I need you," I believed him. Chapter 1, the door. He arrived smelling like rain and whiskey. The first sound was not a knock, it was metal against wood. Soft, precise. Once, twice. I had spent so many years above my father's watch shop that I knew the language of tiny sounds better than most people knew their own names. Loose hinge, cheap brass, cracked spring, bad escapement. But this sound had weight to it, not hurried, not polite. A ring, I thought, before I even crossed the apartment. It was after midnight, and Chicago had gone slick and black with rain. The window over my sink shivered every time the wind hit it. Downstairs, the darkened shop smelled like oil, old varnish, and cedar drawers that had been opened and closed by 3 generations of careful hands. Upstairs, my apartment was smaller than the memory of it. Since my father died, every room had felt 1 chair too empty. The sound came again: metal, wood. Then a man's voice, low and rough enough to make the hallway feel smaller. "Elena." I froze with one hand on the lamp chain. Nobody who came to the shop that late ever said my first name like that. Like it was something he already owned the right to use. I should have stayed quiet. My father had taught me that. Never open the door after midnight unless you know the shape of the trouble. But the voice was followed by the faint scrape of leather against the frame, like someone shifting his weight because standing had become an argument. I looked through the peephole. The man outside was too large for the narrow hall. Black coat, dark hair damp with rain, one broad shoulder braced against the wall as if the building had offended him personally. He had his head slightly lowered. I saw the cut above his eyebrow first. Then the blood dried along the side of his neck. Then the gold watch hanging loose from his hand by a snapped chain. And then I recognized him. Everybody in Little Italy knew Dante Salvator's face even if they pretended not to. Men lowered their eyes when he passed. Women lowered their voices. Priests somehow found other doors to walk through. He was the kind of man who made silence move ahead of him like an advance guard. I had seen him twice before from a distance. Once at my father's funeral, standing at the back of the church without coming forward. Once across the street from the shop 3 months later, speaking to a man who looked frightened enough to forget how hands worked. I had never seen him drunk. He raised his head slightly, and even through the peephole, I felt the impact of those eyes. Dark, steady in a way that should not have been possible with the amount of whiskey sharp in his posture. "Elena," he said again, "open the door." Every good decision I had ever made stood on one side of that sentence. I opened it anyway. Rain-cooled air slipped in around him, carrying the smell of wet wool, expensive cologne, and whiskey cut with something colder. Night air, street water, the city after midnight. He looked at me once, quickly, as if confirming I was real, then passed me into the apartment. "I need you." No greeting, no explanation. Just those 3 words, dragged out of him like wire through flesh. He still had a gun in his left hand. I stared at it first because I was not stupid, and then at the watch in his right. The casing was cracked. One of the lugs had sheared off completely. The crystal was spidered, and the second hand was jammed halfway between numbers, trembling but going nowhere. "You're holding it too tightly," I heard myself say. He blinked. I pointed at the watch, not the gun. "The mainspring's already stressed. If you keep squeezing it like that, you'll snap what's left." For one suspended second, nothing happened. Then something shifted in his expression, not softness. He did not look like a man built for softness. But surprise, yes, real and unguarded. I held out my hand toward the gun first. He looked down at it, then at me. If I had thought about what I was doing, I would never have done it. But my father had spent years putting broken instruments into my hands and saying the same thing: steadiness is a decision, not a feeling. Give me that, I said quietly. Before you fall over and shoot my floor. His mouth moved, not quite a smile, not anything kind, but something dangerously close to respect. You don't start where most people start, he said. I don't want blood in my apartment. He gave me the gun, just like that. Cold metal settled into my palm with astonishing weight. I moved backward, put it on the side table out of his reach, and turned back to him. He was watching me with the odd stillness of a predator, deciding whether to be offended or impressed. Then I took the watch from him. It was warm from his hand. The chain was slick with rain and something darker I refused to identify. I stepped aside, and he came in without asking, bringing the storm with him. Water marked the floorboards in blunt, dark crescents. He was taller up close than the hallway had allowed, broad in a way that made the room change around him. Even drunk, he moved like control was a habit his body kept when the rest of him failed. The lamp by my workbench threw honey-colored light over the cracked gold case. My father's magnifying lens still hung where he had left it. For a second, grief lifted its head in me so sharply I almost sat down. This was Lucia's, Dante said. I looked up. Your sister. He went still. I had not meant to say it. But everybody in our neighborhood knew about Lucia Salvetter. The beautiful younger sister. The one who died in an explosion 6 years ago. The one nobody mentioned aloud if they valued their teeth. His gaze dropped to my face as if remeasuring it. You know too much. It's a small neighborhood. A line of fatigue cut across his mouth. Can you fix it? Not tonight. That answer did something to the room. His shoulders squared a fraction, the air tightening around us. Not anger, worse, expectation. It has to be tonight. It can't. I set the watch under the lamp. I can stabilize it tonight. To repair it properly, I need to disassemble the movement, clean the pivots, replace the stem, and pray the balance staff isn't bent. If I rush it, I destroy it. He stared at the watch. Then he braced both hands on my workbench, head lowered for one small second, as if the act of staying upright had become private work. Do the part that doesn't destroy it, he said, so I did. I worked while he stood across from me, silent except for the roughened drag of his breathing. The tweezers clicked. Tiny screws lined up beside my cloth pad. The case opened with a reluctant sigh. Inside, the movement was fine Swiss work under all the damage, delicate, expensive, old enough to have belonged to someone loved carefully. But there was more. A false plate under the movement. Hidden. Cleverly fitted, I felt rather than saw his attention sharpen. What? He asked. Nothing yet. I kept my voice even. When I slid the plate 0.5 millimeter, I found an inner compartment. Inside was a folded strip of old paper. Dante's hand landed on the workbench beside mine, not touching me, not quite. But close enough that I felt the heat of him and the full shock of how large his hand was compared to my tools. Give it to me. I did. He unfolded the strip, read it once, and all the alcohol seemed to leave his body at the same time. Whatever was on the paper changed him. The room did not get louder, but it got more dangerous. That was the only way I knew how to say it. He folded it again with exact care. You're coming with me? I looked up so fast the magnifying lens slipped from my forehead. No, yes, I fixed your watch. You stabilized it. That is still more than most women do for strange armed men at 1 a.m. He straightened slowly. I'm not strange, little saint. That's what makes this worse. It was the first time he called me that, not tenderly, not even warmly. It sounded like an observation he did not trust. I have a shop, I said. I have a life. For the next 72 hours, you have a problem. He glanced toward the paper in his hand, and if you stay here, it becomes a short one. My heart gave one ugly thud. What was on that note? Something people kill for. I'm not going anywhere with you. His eyes met mine. Exhaustion darkened them, but so did certainty. The frightening thing about Dante Salvetter was not that he was powerful. It was that he did not seem to require anybody's agreement to continue being exactly what he was. He reached for the gun on the table, paused, and looked at me first. A courtesy. That somehow made it worse. Then he tucked it into the back of his waistband and held my coat out. "I'm giving you 2 minutes, Alina." "For what?" "To choose the version of this night where I ask." The rain beat harder against the window. Somewhere below us, the old regulator clock in the shop chimed one heavy note. I thought of my father, of the debts piled in the office drawer, of the acceptance letter from a restoration institute in Florence I had not answered because leaving felt too much like another funeral. I thought of the folded paper in Dante's hand, of the blood drying at his temple, of the terrible fact that I believed him when he said staying would be worse. I put on my coat. His gaze dropped briefly to my hands as I locked the apartment, as if checking for a tremor. There wasn't one. That, more than anything, seemed to trouble him. When I turned, he stepped aside to let me pass first. The soft metallic tap of his ring touched the doorframe as he followed me out. Then he locked the shop behind us from the outside. And one door in my life closed for good. Chapter 2, The Rules. Rosa served cake like a threat. If fear had a temperature, it was the cold of marble under borrowed slippers at 3 in the morning. Dante's house was not really a house. It was a fortress pretending to have inherited taste. The windows were too tall, the hallways too silent, the walls too clean of anything accidental. Oil paintings watched from gilt frames. Lamps threw warm islands of light that did not soften the armed men standing in corners trying to look ornamental. I had not slept. Technically, I had lain down in a guest room the size of my entire apartment and stared at a painted ceiling until dawn bled gray against the curtains. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Dante in my doorway with Lucia's watch in his hand and that strange, stripped-down sentence in his mouth. "I need you." By breakfast, I hated him for how much those words had followed me. Rosa Conti found me before anybody else could. She knocked once and entered without waiting, carrying a tray heavy enough to suggest either hospitality or threat. She was in her 60s, compact, silver-haired, and dressed entirely in black despite the pale pink apron tied around her waist. Her eyes were shrewd and unimpressed. If Dante ruled the house through silence, Rosa ruled it through the conviction that everybody else was eating wrong. "You are too thin," she announced. That was her first sentence to me. "I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't put color back in your face." She set the tray down. Coffee, toast, eggs with herbs, a slice of almond cake dusted in powdered sugar. "Eat before the men downstairs make the whole place smell like ammunition and bad decisions." I blinked. "Are you always this welcoming to kidnappings?" She snorted. "If he kidnapped you, there would be tape. This is one of his softer mistakes." Before I could answer, another voice floated in from the hall. "Rosa, if there's cake on that tray for her, and not for me, I want it formally recorded that I am being persecuted inside my own workplace." A man in a charcoal suit leaned into the doorway. He was around 30, handsome in a slightly overmanaged way, with expressive brows and the exhausted eyes of someone tasked with preventing disasters caused by rich, violent men. He looked at my tray, then at Rosa, and pressed a hand dramatically to his chest. "You put sugar in front of me on purpose." "You have been on a diet since Easter," Rosa said. "It is now October. Either marry a lettuce leaf or eat like a Christian." "This is what I live with," he told me mournfully. "Open hostility, daily temptation, no support for wellness." "Who are you?" I asked. "Nico Bellini. Logistics, transport, emergency cleanup, occasional emotional labor." He stepped into the room and lowered his voice as if confiding state secrets. "Also, for reasons not recognized by the Vatican, in love with this woman." Rosa rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might detach. "You are in love with my cannoli," she said. "I can be both a serious man and a pastry enthusiast." "No." That was his first funny moment, and to my everlasting irritation, I almost laughed. Nico caught it anyway. "There she is." "She still has a pulse. Good. The boss looked like death reheated when he brought you in." The words lodged under my ribs. "Where is he?" "Office," Nico said, pretending to be sober and terrifying. "He asked whether you slept." He glanced meaningfully at the untouched cake. "I'm going to lie in a way that helps everyone." Rosa smacked the back of his head lightly with a spoon and ordered him out in Italian. He left still talking, mostly to himself, about fasting being impossible in a house where butter was weaponized. I ate half the eggs and none of the cake. Then Dante sent for me. His office was on the first floor at the far end of a corridor lined with old black and white photographs. Men in suits, banquets, funerals, handshakes that looked like truces. When I paused in front of one frame, I saw a much younger Dante beside an older man with his same jaw and colder eyes. Family resemblance, if family resemblance had ever learned how to ruin nations. A guard opened the office door. The room beyond smelled faintly of leather, paper, and something darkly expensive, Dante's cologne underneath fresh coffee. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held books nobody here had time to read. A map of the city covered one wall, full of discreet pins and handwritten notes. And behind the desk sat the man who had dragged me out of my life before dawn. He was sober now. That was somehow worse. The cut over his eyebrow had been cleaned. He wore a black shirt with the sleeves rolled once, showing strong forearms and a plain watch on his wrist, steel this time, not gold. Nothing in him looked careless. Not the angle of his shoulders. Not the placement of his hands, not the silence. On the desk between us lay Lucia's repaired watch movement under glass. "You fixed more than you claimed you would," he said. I was awake, so you kept working. It bothered me unfinished. His gaze rested on me for one long beat. "I know the feeling." He stood. The men in the room, two by the window, one near the door, shifted almost invisibly the way other people changed posture around weather. That was how his power worked. Not speeches, not theatrics. "Gravity, these are the rules," he said. I folded my arms. I didn't agree to rules. Still happening. He came around the desk and stopped a measured distance away. "You stay inside. You use the phone in your room if you need anything. If you need to go downstairs, you go with Rosa or Nico. No windows after dark. No answering doors. No wandering. That sounds a lot like kidnapping with better flooring. That sounds like keeping you alive. You still haven't told me what was on the note." "No." His refusal was so flat it nearly made me step back. I had a sudden, stupid awareness of where his hands were, relaxed at his sides, capable of enormous damage, controlled by something harder than temper. "You brought danger to my door," I said quietly. His jaw shifted. "Danger had your address before I arrived." That made my stomach turn. Your father kept things for my family." I stared at him. Kept things, he repaired what needed repairing and minded his own business. My father was a clockmaker. He was that too. Anger hit clean and fast. "You don't get to do that." "Do what?" "Walk into my life in the middle of the night and turn my father into some shadow in one of your stories." For the first time, I saw something react behind his eyes. Not guilt exactly, not yet, but impact. He stepped closer. Instinct told me to move back. Pride refused. "You think I wanted you in this house?" he asked. I swallowed. "No. I think you wanted what I can do." He went still in a way that felt like a choice. "That's the safer version." The room tightened. Almost. That was the first real almost between us, though I didn't have a name for it then. He stood too close. I felt the heat of him, the faint clean edge of aftershave over the colder scent of night still caught in his coat. His gaze dropped once to my mouth, and then away so quickly I might have imagined it if his throat had not moved on the swallow he clearly did not want me to see. Then he stepped back. Restraint. Sharp and immediate, he reached instead for the glass case holding Lucia's watch. "You will finish this in the workshop downstairs," he said. "And when I tell you to move, you move." I hated the steadiness of my own voice when I answered. "And if I refuse?" His ring tapped once against the glass. Metal, glass, that soft, precise sound. "Then I carry you," he said. And neither of us likes that outcome. I followed him downstairs, because defiance is a much easier language when the person across from you is not capable of making every threat sound like a fact. The house workshop stunned me into silence. It had been assembled for a man with money and impossible standards. Benches, lathes, trays of oiled parts. Swiss files, jewel presses, movement holders, cleaning machines newer than anything I owned. And in the center, under a hanging task lamp, a cedar table not unlike my father's. My chest tightened so suddenly I had to look away. Dante noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything and spoke about almost none of it. "If something's missing," he said, "tell Matteo." A lean man by the far shelf inclined his head, Matteo Greco. I recognized him from whispers, not sight, Dante's consigliere, the one people said had the patience of a priest and the conscience of nobody useful in a war. His gaze on me was careful, not unkind. Miss Rossi, Elena, Matteo. He was the first person in that house to say my name like it belonged to me. I set my tools down and started to work. Behind me, men came and went. Italian rose and fell in controlled bursts. Phones vibrated. Someone mentioned a warehouse on Halstead. Someone else answered too quickly. Every nerve in my body felt tuned to the room. By noon, I understood one thing very clearly. My old life had not followed me here. And when Dante spoke from behind me without raising his voice, every man in the workshop stopped moving. "Eat," he said. I turned. He had set a plate beside my bench. Rosa's cake sat on it like a bribe. "I'm not hungry." Bad answer. "I'm working." His gaze dropped to the screwdriver in my hand, then back to my face. "You can argue with me, little saint. You'll still eat." Something in me should have flinched at the nickname. Instead, unreasonably, I felt it settle. He walked away before I could answer. And I realized too late that what frightened me was not his control. It was mine around him. Chapter 3, The Watch. He knew what my silence meant. By the second day, I knew the sound of Dante's house. Not the obvious sounds. Not footsteps or doors or the low traffic hum from the avenue beyond the gates. I knew the other sounds. The particular silence of armed men trying to seem harmless. The way conversations stopped half a second before Dante entered a room. The faint murmur of Italian in hallways when something had gone wrong, but not wrong enough yet to become shouting. The click of Matteo's lighter when he was thinking. The long theatrical sighs Nico released every time Rosa put cream in front of him and called it mercy. I also knew I was being watched. Not constantly. Dante was too disciplined for anything so crude. But whenever I lifted my head from Lucia's watch or crossed a corridor or paused too long at a window, there was always a man somewhere noticing. It should have made me feel trapped. Instead, against my own better judgment, it made me feel expensive. That irritated me enough to work harder. The hidden compartment inside Lucia's watch had not contained a confession or a fortune. Just a strip of paper with a column of initials and dates written in my father's narrow script. At first glance, it meant nothing. At second glance, it meant enough to make Dante gather half his inner circle before breakfast and send 2 men to Cicero with guns under their jackets. I had not been invited to the meeting, but the workshop shared a wall with the smaller conference room, and old buildings never kept secrets as well as rich men believed. Through the vent I heard fragments, judges, shipment routes, someone inside, the uncle knows, no. That last word was Dante's, short, final, dangerous. When the meeting ended, Matteo came in with a velvet tray of spare parts and sat on the bench across from mine. He had the kind of face age would improve into severity. Dark suit, dark hair threaded at the temple with silver, hands too steady for a man in his profession. "You learned this from your father?" he asked. I was fitting a replacement stem. Everything useful, and some things that weren't. He watched the tiny gears turning under my loupe. "Dante said you hear timing better than most watchmakers. My father used to say some people read faces and I read friction. Is that why you're not afraid of him?" The screwdriver paused in my fingers. "I didn't say that. You didn't need to." I put the watch down carefully. "I'm afraid of plenty. Not in the way other people are." That was true enough to feel rude. I looked at him. Should I be? Matteo considered the question instead of answering it. I liked him instantly for that. "You should be careful," he said. Fear changes shape too often to be useful. Before I could ask what that meant, Nico blew into the room carrying 3 folders, a black coffee, and the expression of a man actively betrayed by civilization. "I have survived another lunch," he announced. "Barely. Rosa says olive oil is not a carb, which is exactly the kind of technicality that destroys empires." "She likes you," I said. "She wants to bury me well fed." He leaned against the bench and peered at the open watch. "That thing's causing more trouble than a mistress at a christening." "It's older than your jokes," Matteo said. "Not possible. My jokes are historic." Then Nico lowered his voice and bent toward me. "For the record, The boss has already threatened 2 men today and a federal prosecutor yesterday. You are currently the only person in this building he has asked instead of ordered. That's not true. It is. He asked whether you had enough light in here. I stared. Nico grinned at my silence. See, romance, Mafia style, we're all very moved. Matteo made a sound that could have been a laugh if he had been a looser man. I was still trying to decide whether to deny feeling anything at all when Dante walked in. The room changed. That was the simplest truth of him. Air, temperature, attention, everything aligned. He wore a charcoal suit today. No tie, no visible weapon, which only made the men around him look more armed by comparison. His gaze went first to the watch, then to Matteo, then to Nico, and finally to me. Out, he said. Nico clutched his folders. I was supporting morale. You were talking. A severe and personal interpretation. Out, Nico. He left in a whisper of expensive shoes and offended dignity. Matteo followed more gracefully, but not before giving me a look that said be careful in a warmer language than Dante's house usually offered. Then we were alone. Dante came to stand beside me at the bench, not touching, never by accident. That seemed to be another rule of his. Did you sleep? He asked. The question was so ordinary it almost felt invasive. Some eat. Enough. Lie better. I glanced up. You ask strange questions for a man who collects enemies. His gaze stayed on the watch. You answer strange ones for a woman with no leverage. That sounds like an insult. It's an observation. There was that edge again, the one that made even his calm feel dangerous. I turned back to the movement and adjusted the balance. The hidden plate wasn't original, I said. It was added after the watch was made. You can tell. The screws don't match the period, and the engraving inside was recut to hide tool marks. I pointed with the tip of the tweezers. Whoever modified it knew what they were doing. My mother had it repaired once after Lucia dropped it. I looked at him. How old was she? 17. Something in the way he answered pressed against my ribs, not only grief, memory with teeth. I fitted the plate back into place and turned the crown. The second hand moved, smooth now, whole. The tiny beat of it filled the space between us. He kept this safe, I said, meaning my father. Dante's jaw shifted. Yes. From you? A quiet question. A dangerous one. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached past me for the loop, and his sleeve brushed my bare forearm. That was all. A line of heat from wrist to elbow. A contact so small it would have been ridiculous to notice if my body had not noticed it, like a betrayal. Almost. He set the loop down without using it. Your father kept many things safe, he said. Not all of them from me. I should have asked more. Instead, I said the wrong thing. You look less tired today. His head turned. A mistake. I knew at the moment I made it. Not because he seemed offended, but because his face changed in a way that let me see the man under the control for one impossible second. Tired, yes. And harder hit by my noticing than he had any right to be. Then the phone on the wall rang. He answered before the second tone. Speak. He listened. The muscles in his neck tightened. He said one sentence in Italian that I did not understand, but felt like cold water anyway. Then he hung up and reached for the watch. We're moving, he said. Why, your shop was just searched. All the blood left my face. By who? Men dressed like police. He pocketed the watch. They asked the neighbors about you. Panic hit sharp enough to shake me this time. My apartment? I already sent someone. I stood too fast, knocking a tray of gears sideways. Dante caught it before it hit the floor. His hand closed over mine in the same motion. Warm, large, absolute. We both stopped. My breath got lost somewhere between my lungs and my mouth. His gaze dropped to where our hands touched. Not hunger, not yet, something more dangerous because it was less named. Then he let go. Restraint again. Immediate, deliberate. Pack what you need, he said quietly. I hated how rough my voice sounded. What if I need my life back? His eyes lifted to mine. That's not in the bag. He turned and left the room. A minute later, as I stood in the guest room shoving clothes into a case with fingers that did not want to work, I heard the soft metallic tap of his ring against the doorframe outside. He did not come in. He just stood there and watched the crack under the door, as if guarding a threshold he had already crossed too far. Dante, she had taken the gun from his hand without shaking. That should not have mattered. In his world, steadiness was purchased with blood, inherited through bad fathers, or forged in men too damaged to call it virtue. Elena Rossi had done it in a cotton nightgown, with sleep still in her eyes. Then she had corrected the pressure of his grip on Lucia's watch, as if the object mattered more than the danger attached to it. Now her shop had been searched, his uncle was asking questions he had no business asking, and the girl upstairs was packing for a war she still thought might be temporary. Dante stood outside her door and understood, with sudden unwelcome certainty, that she was no longer a task. She was the crack. Chapter 4. The stairwell, his hand closed over my mouth to save me. The safe house smelled like dust, polished wood, and old money trying to disguise its rot. It stood on the north side, hidden behind an iron gate and a row of half-dead hedges, one of the properties the Salvator family used when the city got too interested in their movements. By then, I knew enough not to ask how many houses existed only for danger. The answer would have been too large and too practiced. They moved me there by late afternoon, along with Lucia's watch, 2 armed men, Matteo and Nico, who spent the drive muttering darkly about protein bars and emotional exhaustion. "I'm telling you," he said from the front seat, turning halfway around. "Rosa packed me celery as if I'm livestock. You see how I suffer. This is why I can't commit." "A man requires softness." "Drive," Matteo said. "I am driving. Then suffer quietly." Nico sighed with all the solemnity of a widower and caught my eye in the rearview mirror. "If I disappear, tell Rosa I died brave and underfed." It was impossible not to smile. That, too, felt like a betrayal of the situation. The safe house had 3 floors, heavy curtains, and locks that looked old enough to have opinions. Dante arrived an hour after us. I knew it before I saw him because the house changed first. Men straightened, voices dropped. Somewhere in the hall, someone stopped laughing mid-syllable. Then came the tap, metal, wood, his ring against the frame as he entered the sitting room. He looked like he had put on another layer of himself before coming here. Dark overcoat, black gloves, no visible fatigue. But I had seen him in my hallway at 1 in the morning asking for help like the word burned, and that memory made his polish feel more dangerous, not less. "Any word from the shop?" I asked. He took off his gloves 1 finger at a time. "Nothing missing. That you know of." His gaze shifted to me. "Yes, I should have stopped there." Instead I said, "Did you send men because you were worried about the watch or about me?" The room went very still. Matteo, by the fire, bent over a folder with theatrical intensity. Nico examined a bowl of pears as if they had confessed to espionage. Dante put his gloves on the table. "If you want to challenge me, Elena, do it in private." That wasn't a challenge. It was. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. The silence after it did his work for him. I went hot with anger anyway. "Then maybe stop talking to me like I'm an object you stored in a better room." Something flickered in Matteo's face. Interest, maybe. Nico, coward that he was, fled with the pears. Dante crossed the room, not quickly. That would have been easier. He came toward me with the same calm he carried everywhere, and I realized that what terrified men was not rage. It was certainty without hurry. He stopped close enough for me to smell clean wool and that colder layer beneath his cologne, like he had come in from the dark and not entirely left it outside. "You are not an object," he said. Could have fooled me. His jaw flexed once. "Objects don't disobey me this often." Before I could decide whether that was an insult or something worse, a crash exploded from the back of the house. Glass, shouting, then gunfire, everything broke at once. Matteo was moving before I understood I had stood up. Dante caught my wrist, yanked me toward him, and pushed me down behind the sofa as bullets shattered the front windows in a spray of glittering fragments. Men shouted in Italian. A lamp went out. The room filled with the bitter metallic stink of gunpowder so quickly it coated the back of my throat. "Stay down," Dante said. "I can help." "No." Another burst of gunfire, footsteps in the hall. Dante hauled me up and half-dragged, half-carried me toward the rear stairwell. My slippers slipped on the runner. The house shook with movement. Somewhere downstairs a man cried out and was silenced so fast I understood exactly what sort of world I had entered. At the landing, voices rose below us. Dante pivoted, slammed me back against the wall, and covered my mouth with one hand. I went rigid, not because he hurt me, because he did not. His palm was warm, controlled. He pressed me into the shadow of the stairwell, his body braced in front of mine, all hard lines and withheld violence. I could feel the breadth of him through my dress, the measured force he used to hold me still without crushing me. The way he turned his head, slightly toward the hall like a man, listening for the exact second a life could be taken. Footsteps passed below us. A voice I didn't know said, "Upstairs." Dante's hand tightened fractionally over my mouth. Not fear, warning. My heart was hitting so hard I thought they would hear it. He leaned close enough that his mouth brushed the shell of my ear when he spoke, barely above breath. "Don't move, little saint." Everything in me went hot and cold at once. The men below kept moving. The silence they left behind was worse. When Dante removed his hand, I turned too quickly and found my face inches from his throat. There was blood on the collar of his shirt. Not much. Fresh. "You're hurt," I whispered. "Later." "No, now." He looked at me as if I had used the wrong language in the wrong country. Gunfire still cracked somewhere in the house, but less often now. Closer to finished. I touched the edge of his collar before I could think better of it. His whole body stilled. Not surprise this time. Impact, raw and brief and immediately hidden. "It's not deep," I said. "You checked. You were bleeding on me." One corner of his mouth almost moved, almost, then Matteo's voice came up the stairs. "Clear." Dante stepped back first. Of course he did. He led me down to the kitchen, where the aftermath of violence had already become work. Two men with blood on their sleeves, one body by the service entrance under a sheet. Matteo speaking quietly into a phone, Nico in the pantry clutching a carving knife and looking personally insulted by mortality. "I contributed," Nico said before anyone accused him otherwise. One of them slipped on olive oil. It was tactical. "No one asked," Dante said. "I nearly died for this family. You hid with Parmigiano. It was a strategic cheese location." That was his second funny moment, and I laughed, horrified, breathless, unable not to. The sound made several men turn toward me, as if laughter and gunfire did not belong in the same building. Rosa, who had apparently materialized despite not living there, handed Nico a dish towel and told him if he dripped on her floor again, she would let the next assassin finish him. Then she took one look at Dante's collar and ordered him to sit. He did not. I did it for her. "You're getting blood on the chair," I said. For some reason that worked where concern would not have. He sat. I cleaned the cut at his neck with Rosa's aid kit while he held still in the kitchen chair and pretended not to notice my hands. The room had mostly emptied. Matteo gave us privacy by standing near the door and reading messages he had already memorized. "This was because of the note," I said quietly. Yes, he looked at the blood on the gauze instead of me. Yes, I should have felt satisfied. Instead, I felt sick. "Because of me," I said, "because of what was hidden in your apartment." His gaze lifted, hard and direct. "Not because of you." But that wasn't true, not entirely. I knew it from the way his eyes moved over my face first whenever a door opened. Rosa pressed a clean towel into my hand and left without comment. Matteo followed, drawing the kitchen half-empty behind him. It was one of the first things I learned in Dante's world. Privacy was never given sentimentally. It was offered like a tactical advantage. I cleaned the cut at his neck in silence. Up close, I saw another scar slipping under the open collar of his shirt, pale and ridged, vanishing toward his shoulder. He caught me looking. "Car bomb," he said, not a speech, just fact. My fingers stilled on the cotton. "Lucia." A muscle moved in his jaw. He did not nod. He did not need to. For 1 second, the kitchen lost all its edges. I saw not the man people lowered their voices for, but the brother who had crawled out of fire and built something cold enough to survive what was left. "You stayed alive," I said softly. He looked at me in a way that made the words feel larger than I had intended. "Barely." The answer did something to my throat. I taped the dressing down and stepped back. He stood at once, because sitting still was apparently a private humiliation. His ring struck the wooden table as he reached for his jacket. Metal, wood, the same sound that had opened my door. Someone inside gave them this address, Matteo said from the doorway. Dante's face changed without changing at all. The kitchen went colder. When he turned away, his shoulder brushed mine. Not enough to claim, enough to unsteady. Then he said to no one and everyone, find him. And I understood that the night had not ended. It had only widened. Chapter 5. The notebook my father had hidden the map inside time. The next morning began with silence, which in Dante's world was never peace. It was preparation. Rain had passed in the night, leaving the city scrubbed raw and silver under a weak October sun. From the second-floor study window of the safe house, I could see bare branches moving against the lake wind. Inside, everything smelled like coffee, gun oil, and the starch from fresh linen Rosa had somehow produced out of nowhere, as if even violence should happen in a properly managed household. Dante had not slept. I knew it before I saw him. There is a particular stillness to people who have gone past fatigue and come out the other side sharpened by it. He wore a dark suit and no tie. His hair was still damp from a shower, though the cut at his neck had bled through the edge of the bandage. He was standing over a table laid out with maps, photographs, and Lucia's watch. I stopped at the threshold. His ring tapped once against the tabletop as he looked up. "Come in, little saint." The nickname should have irritated me. Instead, it landed low and strange in my chest. Matteo stood by the mantel with a folder. Nico sprawled in an armchair, one ankle on the opposite knee, looking simultaneously elegant and personally offended by being awake before noon. "I want it documented," Nico said when he saw me, "that I was promised breakfast and instead got conspiracy." "You got breakfast," Matteo said. "I got eggs without joy." Rosa, from the hall, answered without appearing. "Joy is for people who finish their coffee before complaining." Nico looked heavenward. "One day she'll admit she loves me. One day," Matteo said dryly, "you'll survive a meal quietly." The warmth of them, ridiculous and sharp-edged, should not have fit inside that house. It did anyway. Dante pushed Lucia's watch toward me. "Show them." I crossed to the table. The folded strip from the hidden compartment lay beside it, my father's narrow handwriting glaring up at me like an accusation. I had spent part of the night staring at those initials and dates until a different memory rose from somewhere I had not touched in months. My father at the back bench, muttering over parish clocks and city contracts, marking repairs not by address but by face position. 12 for west, 3 for river, 6 for basement access, 9 for chapel crypts. He had thought in mechanisms. "So did I. These aren't names," I said, touching the paper. "They're clock positions." Dante's gaze sharpened, Matteo straightened, even Nico sat up. I pointed at the first line. "The initials matter less than the time next to them. If you lay the city parishes and properties by my father's old service routes, they create direction points. He used it when he didn't want employees reading his notes." "You knew this last night?" Dante asked. There it was, the question under the question. "No," I said too quickly. He heard the lie. Of course he did. His face didn't change, but the air around him did. I took a breath. I suspected it. Different answer. My father used that system for repair logs. I didn't know he was using it for. I looked at the names again. I still couldn't quite say what this was without admitting my father had been something other than the simple man who taught me to oil gears and say thank you. For secrets. Nico whistled softly. Your family dinners were more interesting than mine. Dante did not look away from me. And where do the directions point? I wanted to keep something. I didn't even know what. Some last private corner of my father that had not already been dragged into the light by men with guns and expensive shoes. But the room was full of consequences now, and I was tired of pretending otherwise. St. Agnes Chapel, I said, the old one on Racine. Matteo swore under his breath in Italian. Dante said nothing. That was worse. I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure, I said. And because every time I tell you something about my father, he becomes less mine. For the first time since I had walked in, something moved behind Dante's eyes that was not calculation. It was too brief to call tenderness, but it made my ribs hurt anyway. Matteo cleared his throat. St. Agnes belongs to the family trust. Vittorio oversees the trust, Dante said. There was the name again. Uncle, mentor, ghost in every room nobody wanted to light fully. Nico rubbed his jaw. So either the old man is stealing from himself, which is inefficient even by our standards, or he wants us to know he's near the ledger. Ledger, the word landed, solid, real. I looked at Dante. That's what this is about. He held my gaze. Yes, a list of judges and routes and police names, a list of men bought years ago and still own now. And my father hid it. He kept part of it. Something hot and wild moved through me. Grief, anger, pride, nausea. I couldn't tell. My father, with his aprons and patient hands and habit of humming under his breath over escapements, had stood this close to a machine that could eat cities. Dante saw too much of my face. He came around the table, slow enough not to startle me, which somehow startled me more. He kept it from the wrong men, he said. That includes you? A beat. Yes, the honesty hit harder than reassurance would have. Nico rose and wandered toward the far shelf, which held a small brass carriage clock knocked sideways during the night's rush. He lifted it, frowned, and set it in front of me. This one's dying too, for variety. I took it automatically. The front enamel was intact, pretty in a severe French way, but when I turned it over I found a hairline fracture hidden beneath the brass filigree on the back plate. It looks solid, I murmured. But, Matteo asked, the crack's underneath. It holds until pressure lands in the wrong place. Nico's expression softened in that quick surprising way funny men sometimes break your heart. That sounds unhealthy and extremely on brand for this household. I almost smiled. Dante didn't, but the line of his mouth changed, infinitesimally. I set the little clock on its side and opened the case. If I reinforce the plate, it'll keep time again. You can fix that now? Dante asked. Yes, do it. Not because the object mattered. Because he was listening to what I could do with broken things and filing it somewhere dangerous. I worked while they argued routes and surveillance around me. Hands busy, mind louder than it should have been. Half an hour later, Gianni Farah came in carrying 2 garment bags and a roll of floor plans. He was Dante's head of security at the safe house, broad-shouldered, graying at the temples, with kind eyes that made you forget too briefly what kind of men survived long around Dante. Miss Rossi, he said, setting the plans down, need anything? No. If you do, ask me, not Nico. He'll bring flowers and the wrong ammunition. Nico looked offended. I have range. You have opinions, Gianni said. I liked him instantly. That would matter later in the cruelest possible way. By the time I closed the repaired carriage clock, the room had arranged itself around a plan. Sent Agnes, 2 cars. Limited team. Dante, Matteo, Gianni, 2 shooters. No, I said before I could stop myself. Every head turned. Dante's expression went quiet. No, you can't go there like that. Why? Because if my father hid something in a chapel he serviced, he hid it where repairmen could reach it without attracting attention. I wiped my hands on a cloth. Men with guns attract attention. Nico lifted a finger. Strong anti-gun messaging for this house. I ignored him. There's a maintenance corridor behind the sacristy. Old clock access ladder. If the compartment is where I think it is, I need to go. No, Dante said. The word landed like a lock. I lifted my chin. Then you don't get what you came for. We stared at each other across the table, 2 stubbornnesses built in different fires. Almost. It lived there too, in the length of his silence. In the way his gaze dropped once to the pulse in my throat and came back up harder. Then he exhaled through his nose. You go with me, you stay beside me. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I felt claimed in some smaller, more dangerous sense. As the room broke apart to prepare, Matteo stopped by my side. Warn him next time before you corner him in public, he murmured. I wasn't cornering him. You were, he simply happened to enjoy it. Before I could answer, Dante called my name, not Alina, just a slight turn of his head and that dark attention locking on mine. I looked down at the repaired carriage clock in my hand, at the hidden crack strengthened from beneath where no one would see it. It kept time anyway. And for the first time since he took me from my shop, I wondered whether staying whole and staying honest were going to remain the same thing. Chapter 6. The chapel. He kissed me like he was still stopping. St. Agnes looked abandoned from the street. That was part of its usefulness. The chapel sat behind a locked iron fence and a row of wind-warped shrubs, its stone facade dark with age and city soot, the bell tower cut against a colorless afternoon sky. The parish had merged years ago with a larger church 2 neighborhoods over. Now weddings did not happen there. Funerals rarely did. The dead passed through newer halls with better parking and less history. But history had weight. Men like Dante stored things in it. I rode in the back of the second car with him and Matteo. No one spoke for most of the drive. The leather smelled faintly of smoke and cold weather. Dante's shoulder was a controlled heat beside mine. Every time the car turned, my coat brushed his sleeve and my body reacted as if that tiny contact deserved documentation. Outside, Chicago slid by in wet grays and brick reds. Inside, war arranged itself quietly. Gianni met us at the side gate. He had already cut the chain and looped it to look untouched. Efficient, invisible, competent. I hated, suddenly and for no reason I could justify then, how relieved I was to see him. The chapel interior was colder than outside. Wax, dust, damp stone. The old pews had been draped to protect them from leaks. A statue of St. Michael stood near the side altar with one chipped wing and a face too serene for the room it was in. Our footsteps echoed no matter how carefully we moved. "This way," I whispered. Dante stayed close enough that the back of my coat occasionally touched the front of his, not by accident exactly. By design, a moving wall. The maintenance corridor behind the sacristy was narrow and unlit. Gianni went ahead with a flashlight. Matteo stayed at the rear. Dante put one hand lightly against my lower back as the floor pitched toward the ladder leading up to the clock housing. I nearly missed a rung because of it. Almost. The ladder opened into the bell chamber, a cramped wooden space full of beams, iron supports, and the huge old mechanism controlling the chapel bell. My father had brought me up once when I was 12. I remembered the smell before the shape of it. Dust, iron, pigeon feathers, old grease in the gears. "There," I said, a service panel hid behind the main regulator casing. I knelt and unscrewed it with shaking fingers that steadied only when metal met metal. This was what I knew. This was the language I had before fear. Inside the panel sat a sealed metal tube. Dante crouched beside me as I pulled it free. His knee touched mine for one suspended second and held there, as if both of us were pretending not to notice the choice in it. He took the tube, twisted the cap, and slid out 3 folded sheets. "Matteo." Matteo moved closer. The 2 men bent over the pages. Names, dates, banks, routes. Men bought so deeply into the city's bones that I felt ill looking at them. Then the first shot cracked through stained glass. Everything after that happened in fractures. Gianni shouted. Matteo shoved Dante sideways. A second shot blew through the beam above us, showering splinters down. Dante grabbed me by the coat and dragged me behind the bell housing as bullets punched through old wood. "Stay down," he said. Below us, the chapel exploded into noise, not chaos. Dante's men did not do chaos. Orders snapped. Return fire, fast footsteps, a body hitting pews hard enough to make them groan. I pressed my back to the beam and tried to breathe around the taste of old dust and panic. Dante was already on one knee, gun drawn, sighting through the narrow gap in the bell frame. His face had gone terrifyingly calm. He fired once, twice. A man screamed below. I had never been this close to efficient violence before. No wasted movement, no words. Dante did not rage, he solved. Another shooter appeared in the archway below with a rifle. The angle was wrong. Dante saw it half a second too late. "Down!" I shouted, grabbing his sleeve. The shot slammed into the bell support where his head had been. He turned to me so sharply I thought he was angry. What I saw instead was raw impact. "You saw that?" "Yes. Stay behind me." "I was already behind you." A sound like disbelief almost escaped him. Then Matteo yelled from below that they were being pushed from the rear entrance. Gianni was down in the vestibule. 2 more shooters inbound. Dante looked at the ledger pages in his hand, then at the narrow crawl space behind the regulator housing. Decision moved across his face with brutal speed. He shoved the papers inside my coat. "Take the ladder behind the beam. It leads to the roof hatch." "What?" If they separate us, you keep moving. No, Elena, the use of my name, stripped bare like that, hurt worse than shouting. I'm not leaving you. His hand came up and framed the side of my face for one impossible second. Warm, rough, entirely at odds with the gun in the other hand. Little saint, he said, quieter now, do not make me choose between the ledger and you. My throat closed around everything I might have said. Then footsteps hammered into the bell chamber. Dante moved. I had heard people describe certain men as animals in fights. That was the wrong image for him. Animals are messy, instinctive. Dante was something colder. He crossed the room in 2 strides, took the first attacker's wrist, broke it without visible effort, shot the second man once through the throat, and drove the first into the wall hard enough to crack plaster before I had managed a full breath. The room smelled like powder and old stone and blood. I stared. He turned back to me with that same awful calm, the kind that made other men look away. Roof. Now, I ran because there was nothing else left to do. The hatch opened onto slate wet with old rain and the flat hard wind of the city. Matteo reached us from the adjoining slope a second later, blood on his sleeve but moving well. Gianni did not appear. Car S gone, Matteo said. Rear alley compromised. Dante checked the street below, jaw set like cut stone. Sirens wailed somewhere far enough away to be useless. He looked at the small maintenance shed across the neighboring roofline, then at me. This way. We crossed 2 roofs and dropped into the abandoned rectory through a window Nico somehow had already opened from inside. He was in the kitchen, white-faced and furious. Do you know what kind of cardio this is? I am a passenger princess, Dante. You're alive, Matteo said. Barely, and the priest storage room smelled like despair. I laughed once, sharp and broken. Nico looked so insulted by relief that I nearly cried instead. Dante took me upstairs to a room with a narrow iron bed and lace curtains grayed by age. The adrenaline was leaving my body in ugly waves. My hands would not stop shaking now that we had stopped moving. He closed the door behind us. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he crossed the room and stopped in front of me, not touching, letting me see the choice in his restraint, in the effort of it. You pulled me down, he said. I swallowed. There was a rifle. You saw it before I did. I hear friction, I whispered, hating how thin my voice sounded. I told you. His gaze moved over my face as if memorizing damage. And then, very quietly, he said, I know. That was when I understood, not all of it, not what he felt, because I don't think Dante would have survived that kind of precision spoken aloud, but enough. Enough to know the way he watched me had roots now. Enough to know the reason was not beauty or convenience or proximity. It was that first night, the gun in his hand, the broken watch. The fact that I had not recoiled. Dante, she had looked at a rifle line and reached for him anyway, not because she was reckless. Because she could not watch a mechanism fail without trying to save what it would break. That was the wound and the wonder of Elena Rossi. She steadied what should have frightened her. She corrected the grip on death itself and treated it like a problem of pressure. No one in his world had ever done that. No one had ever unsettled him more. Elena looked up at him, pale and shivering in the dim room, the ledger hidden under her coat and his life still running because she had moved first. He wanted. That was the simplest and most dangerous truth. He lifted one hand toward her face, stopped an inch away, and then lowered it again. Restraint. Again, it nearly killed him. When he finally kissed me, it felt less like taking and more like surrender delayed too long. Soft first, so soft I almost thought he was still deciding not to. His mouth brushed mine once, then again, asking something he would never put into words. I stood very still because every part of me was listening. The rain smell still in his coat. The roughness of his hand where it came to rest, careful, at my waist. The unbearable fact that he could have done anything and chose this. I made a small sound I did not recognize. He stopped at once. Say no, he said against my mouth. I opened my eyes. His were already on mine, dark and wrecked with control. I did not say I want you. I didn't know how. I only knew what it cost me to answer honestly. If you stop now, I whispered, I think I'll feel it everywhere. Something in him broke, not his control, never that completely, but the edge of it. He kissed me again, deeper this time, one hand at the back of my neck, the other still at my waist as if reminding himself where gentleness lived. My hands found his shirt without permission. His heart was beating hard under my palm. That undid me more than the kiss. A knock came at the door. We jerked apart like the room had caught fire. Almost, of course. Nico's voice drifted through the wood. Before anyone does anything that complicates my scheduling, the West Side warehouse is burning and your uncle is on the move. Dante closed his eyes once. When he opened them, the softness was gone, not erased, buried. He touched his forehead to mine for the briefest second, then he stepped back. War, he said. And this time, there was no mistaking who had arrived. Chapter 7. The station. I had a ticket out and still turned back. War made the days lose their edges. Men came and went at hours that no longer meant anything to me. Phones rang in coded bursts. Cars arrived black and left blacker somehow. The safe house shifted again, from refuge to command center, and every room seemed to contain maps, weapons, or voices lowered at my approach. Sint. Agnes had given us only part of the ledger. Enough to hurt, not enough to kill what had already woken. Gianni survived the ambush with a graze to the side and a bandaged shoulder. He apologized to me for scaring me, which felt so decent I nearly hated myself for the cold little knot that had begun to form whenever his eyes stayed on me too long. Suspicion is an ugly thing to wear. It made every kind gesture feel staged. Dante didn't leave my side unless strategy forced him to. He also did not touch me again. That was somehow worse. After the kiss in the rectory, there was a new tension in every doorway, every pause, every exchanged look that stopped 1 second short of honesty. His restraint had become its own atmosphere. He stood too close and then stepped away. He reached for my elbow on stairs and let go first. He said little saint in that same low voice, but there was warmth gathering under it now like heat under stone. By the third day, I could barely breathe around almost. I made my mistake that evening. My father's old notebook had been returned from the shop after Dante's men swept the place again. Matteo brought it to me in the upstairs study with the sort of careful expression men wear when they suspect paper might detonate. It was hidden in the lining of the back office chair, he said. I took it with both hands. My father's handwriting covered the pages in repair codes, customer initials, tiny furious reminders to himself about springs and payment delays, and one note that simply read, "Don't trust polished men." I almost laughed at that. Then I found the last page. There, pressed into the margin near a sketch of a regulator clock face, was the symbol my father only used for private keys. Below it, 1140/shop Michael. I knew what it meant at once. The St. Michael clock in the front window of our shop, the old bronze mantelpiece with the sword-shaped minute hand. My father had repaired it a dozen times. He never sold it, said the balance was temperamental. What he meant, I understood too late, was useful. I should have told Dante. Instead, I closed the notebook. Because if there was another key, another piece of the ledger, Dante would go after it like flame after dry cloth. And if Vittorio was waiting there, blood would finish what paper started. This is the part where I tell you I acted bravely. I didn't. I acted like a daughter who still wanted one private answer before men with guns turned her father into evidence. So I went alone, not quite alone. Nico caught me in the back corridor with my coat half on and his face rearranged itself into horror. Where are you going? Out. He looked at the coat, then at my shoes. Then at the notebook under my arm. That answer has no nutritional value and I reject it. I just need the shop. Elena, I stopped. He never used my name in that tone. No jokes. No theatrical grief, just alarm. You can't go without telling him. If I tell him, he'll come. Yes, Nico said, as if explaining gravity. Because he is an insane person with resources. I need 10 minutes. You need a personality transplant. I moved past him. He swore softly and followed, because for all his nonsense, Nico Bellini was loyal in the way good men often disguise with chatter. Matteo intercepted us at the garage. He took one look at my face and knew. No, please. That was all, one word, honest enough to shame me. He rubbed a hand over his mouth, already angry, already losing. If I call Dante, he'll lock you upstairs for a week. If you don't, I'm back before he knows. Matteo gave Nico a look that said this is a terrible idea and we are doing it anyway. Nico threw up his hands. This family deserves prison, he muttered. I should have become a florist. The shop looked smaller than I remembered. Maybe danger changes scale. Maybe once you've seen men shoot through stained glass, your own front window feels thin in a different way. Inside, the familiar smell hit me so hard my knees nearly loosened. Cedar, brass polish. Old paper, a life I had loved before it became a map. The St. Michael clock sat in the display case exactly where my father had left it. Bronze arch, small dial, sword minute hand at 11:40. My breath caught, I opened the back panel. Inside the casing was a key. Small, iron, old, and a folded note. Not for Dante, for me. Elena, if you are reading this, it means time has finally betrayed me. I only got as far as the first line. The front glass shattered. Matteo shoved me down as shots tore through the shop. Nico dragged me behind the counter, swearing prayers and diet advice at the same time. Men poured in from the alley. I heard one of them yell not to hit the girl. Message, then, not random. Deliberate, Matteo returned fire from one knee by the wall. Calm, exact, the kind of competence that makes you forget it is killing. Back door, he snapped. We ran for it. Halfway there, Matteo jerked and hit the floor hard. The world narrowed to that. Blood, dark and shocking on his coat. Matteo, move, he shouted, but the sound broke halfway. I dropped beside him anyway, hands already on the wound. Training of a different kind. Pressure, cloth, breeze. Nico fired over our heads with trembling aim and enough luck to keep us alive for another second. This was my fault. The thought came clean and total, not because I had been foolish exactly. Because I had decided that my private grief deserved secrecy in a world where secrecy got measured in blood. Sirens wailed closer. Not ours. Never ours. Someone outside shouted in Italian. The shooters scattered before the street filled. Dante arrived less than 2 minutes later. I knew the instant he entered because every sound in the room bent around him. He crossed the broken glass and the spilled gears and the blood and came straight to Matteo first. He knelt, looked once at the wound, then at me. Not at my face, at my hands holding the compress. You left, he said. No shouting, no spectacle, just that. It was worse than fury. Matteo caught his sleeve. My call. Lie, beautiful, useless lie. Dante didn't even look at him. His eyes stayed on mine, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something like disappointment land between us with enough force to bruise. He got Matteo to the car. Nico followed, white as paper and still talking, because some men stop making jokes only when they're dead. I was the last one out of the shop. I looked back once at the smashed window, at the little bronze St. Michael lying on its side, at my father's note still crumpled in my fist, unread past the first line. By midnight, Matteo was in surgery with one bullet removed from under his ribs, and one lung missed by what Rosa called the grace of God and bad aim. Nico had a cut over his temple and a grievance for every saint in Italy. Dante had not spoken to me since the shop. At 1 a.m, he came into the guest room and set an envelope on the bed. Passport, ticket, Florence, my throat closed. What is this? A way out. I looked up at him. You're sending me away? I'm giving you what I should have given you the first night. His face was unreadable. That calm of his had gone so flat it felt dangerous to touch with words. Because I made a mistake. Yes, the honesty sliced. He looked at the ticket, not me. Matteo may live, he may not. Either way, this is what it costs to stay near me. Near you? I whispered. Or inside your war? His jaw tightened once. Same thing. A long silence stretched. He could have made me stay. He didn't. That made everything harder. The car leaves for Union Station in 20 minutes, he said. Florence, by tomorrow night. The Institute still wants you. How do you know that? He finally looked at me then. I know things. Of course he did. He turned to go. Dante. He stopped at the door. I had 1,000 things inside me and none of them came out right. Sorry, don't do this. Ask me to stay. Tell me not to go. Instead, what I said was the only thing honest enough to survive my mouth. You don't get to decide for me what I can bear. His ring tapped once against the doorframe. Metal, wood. You already decided, he said quietly. Now you live with it. Union Station at 2 in the morning was all echo and fluorescent loneliness. I sat on a bench with a passport in my coat pocket, a train ticket in my hand, and my father's note finally open on my lap. The rest of it was short. Trust the man who lets you choose. Not because he is clean, because he is. The key in Michael opens the last door only if time is set backward. I read it twice. Then a third time, the last door, the shop clock, set backward. Dante didn't know, and if Vittorio did, Dante would walk blind into whatever came next. The train doors opened. I stood. I could leave. Truly, no one stopped me. No one called my name. Florence lay in front of me like another life. A clean one, a bright one where men did not bleed on church floors because I had wanted to keep a note to myself. I looked at the ticket. Then I tore it in half. It cost more than paper. It cost the girl who still thought love and danger lived in separate countries. I walked back out into the cold, called the driver Dante had assigned to watch from a distance, and gave him the only address that mattered now, the safe house. I came back by choice. Chapter 8, The Backward Clock. The man who smiled had already sold us. When I walked back into the safe house at 3:12 in the morning, no one looked surprised except Nico. He was in the kitchen with an ice pack pressed to his forehead, and Rosa feeding him broth as if he were a war invalid, instead of a man who had taken one theatrical graze and turned it into opera. He saw me, sat upright, and pointed his spoon at the ceiling. I knew it. I told them. I said she's not the type who boards trains peacefully. Rosa took the spoon away. You don't know any peaceful types. She looked at me then, and something gentler passed over her face before it was hidden under efficiency. You came back, she said. Yes, good, she said, and handed me coffee like absolution. Dante was in the downstairs office alone. I knew because the guards outside the door looked at me with the particular blankness men use when they've been ordered not to interfere with what might happen next. I went in without knocking. He was standing by the city map, jacket off, tie still absent, one hand braced against the table. Fatigue had finally marked him openly, not in his posture, in the shadows under his eyes. In the dangerous quiet of a man who had spent too many hours keeping himself from breaking something. He looked at me once, then at the train ticket, torn in half, still in my hand. You missed your train? I came back. I noticed. His voice gave me nothing, not relief, not anger, nothing I could hold. I crossed the room and put my father's note on the desk. The last key isn't in the chapel. It's in the regulator clock at the shop. My father hid it behind the movement. You have to set the time backward to release the panel. Dante stared at the note. Then at me. You knew. I knew an hour ago. You should have told me yesterday. Yes. There it was, my guilt, my fault, no softer because spoken plainly. A line moved in his cheek. Matteo is alive. I closed my eyes once. Relief hit so hard it left me weak. He asked for coffee and insulted the hospital curtains, Dante added. That's how we knew. The sound that left me was halfway between a laugh and a sob. For a moment, just one, something in Dante's expression loosened. Weariness. Maybe gratitude. Maybe anger too tired to stand fully upright. Then his gaze sharpened. No one leaves this house without me again. That sounded very much like an order. It was, I should have argued. Instead I said, fine. The answer surprised him enough to show. He looked down at the note again. His ring touched the desk once lightly. Gianni moved the shop perimeter before you left, he said. Without being asked. Cold slid through me. You think it was him. I think loyalty becomes interesting when old men start buying sons' medical bills. Gianni's son. I remembered now, leukemia 2 years ago. Long treatment. Expensive. Gianni had once shown me a picture, smiling with the helpless pride of fathers who don't know how to stop loving out loud. You don't know for sure? No, his gaze lifted. That's the problem. We moved within 15 minutes, fewer men, faster cars. Matteo, still at the hospital, forced to stay behind under protest, relayed through 3 phone calls and 1 message calling Dante an arrogant undertaker. Nico insisted on coming despite Rosa's threat to staple him to the sofa. I bring morale, he said, climbing into the second car. You bring commentary, Dante said. In a crisis, same thing. The shop stood dark under police tape that meant nothing to the men who tore it down. Inside, the wreckage looked worse in night silence. Glass crunched under our shoes. Drawers hung open. The St. Michael clock still lay on its side where I had dropped it. I went straight to the regulator clock on the back wall, tall oak case, Roman numerals. Moon phase dial my father had restored by hand. I opened the cabinet, set the hands backward exactly 13 minutes, and heard it, a small internal click far too modern for the clock's age. Dante came up behind me. There. A hidden panel slid open beside the weights. Inside lay a leather ledger and a flash drive. Nico breathed out. We are really committed to mixed media crime. I almost smiled. Then the lights went out, not a trip, not a fuse, a deliberate kill. The room dropped into black so sudden and complete it felt physical. Men shouted. A shot cracked from the front, another from the stairs above the apartment. Dante's hand found my arm instantly. Down, I obeyed. The dark was total except for the thin sweep of one flashlight far too steady to belong to panic. Someone already knew where to aim. Gianni's voice came from near the back door. Boss, gunfire cut him off. Everything inside me went cold. Dante shoved the ledger into my coat and fired toward the flashlight. A body hit the floor. Nico cursed somewhere to my left. Another man screamed. Then a hand closed over my mouth from behind and yanked me backward into the office corridor. I bit hard enough to taste blood. The man swore, not Gianni. A second later, he dragged me through the rear alley door and into a van idling in darkness. The last thing I saw before the doors slammed was Gianni Farah standing under the broken shop light, face gray, gun in his hand, not firing at the men who took me. He had already sold us. They tied my wrists but not expertly, which offended me on practical grounds. The van smelled like wet canvas, gasoline, and the metallic fear I was trying very hard not to feed. Across from me sat Vittorio Salvetter. I knew him at once from the photograph in Dante's corridor. Older now, sharper, silver at the temples like dignity had chosen the wrong vessel. He wore a dark camel coat and gloves the color of old bone. His face had Dante's family lines arranged with none of Dante's conscience. He looked at me with terrible politeness. Elena Rossi, you killed my father. He lifted one eyebrow. Straight to business, I see why he likes you. My throat worked once. Did you? I asked him for something. He refused. His heart did the rest. Liar, maybe not entirely. Men like Vittorio outsourced sin so they could keep their collars clean. He made that watch for Lucia, Vittorio said. A sentimental mistake. Dante confuses sentiment with loyalty. That is the family weakness. And you confuse betrayal with intelligence. His smile deepened. Exactly. He told me enough because he thought I was already broken into usefulness. The bomb that killed Lucia had been meant to frighten Dante into obedience after Dante started asking where family money really went. Instead, it killed the girl, and grief turned Dante harder than fear ever could. My father had kept copies of the ledger after realizing judges and cops were being bought through church charities and family trusts. Vittorio had spent years hunting each fragment. And now, he said almost pleasantly, you are going to tell me if the flash drive is encrypted. I looked at him and saw the mirror at last, not what Dante was. What he would become if he ever stopped letting choice wound him. The van stopped at an old river warehouse. They took me inside, tied me to a chair under a hanging light, and set the flash drive on a crate in front of me. I did not break, mostly because fear got crowded out by fury. Partly because somewhere beneath that was the stupid, stubborn certainty that Dante would come. I hated myself a little for that. Hours passed, or minutes. Time lost definition in the dark. Then Gianni came in alone. He looked 20 years older than he had in the study that morning. My son needed treatment, he said. I laughed once, harsh and unbelieving. So you sold me, I sold time. That's the same thing in your world. He flinched. Good. When he leaned close enough to cut one of my wrist ties and whisper, "Third floor catwalk, east exit, when the lights go," I realized betrayal was not as clean as anger liked to imagine. Then he walked back out. A minute later, the first explosion hit the loading bay. Too late, I thought, and then I heard Dante's gun. Chapter 9, the catwalk, he came for me, but I was already moving. The first thing war teaches you is that rescue is rarely graceful. The warehouse lights blew out in a chain, one popping after another until the whole place dropped into emergency red. Men shouted from the loading bay. Someone hit the fire alarm, and the old bell system began hammering through the building with a frantic metallic clang that bounced off the steel rafters. Gianni's whispered instruction burned in my head. 3rd floor, east exit, when the lights go. I twisted the half-cut tie at my wrist against the chair arm until the fibers bit skin and loosened. My father used to say every mechanism fails where tension is misjudged. So do men, so do knots. By the time footsteps pounded outside the room, one hand was free. I snatched the flash drive from the crate, jammed it into my boot, and ran. Not elegantly, not bravely. I ran like a woman whose body had finally understood what the rest of her had been refusing for days. That surviving this man's world meant choosing action before certainty. The hallway beyond was lit in pulses of red. Smoke drifted low from the loading bay. The catwalk stairs rattled under my feet as gunfire ripped somewhere below. Halfway up, I heard Nico. Of all possible sounds in hell, it was somehow Nico. "This is not cardio, this is persecution," he shouted from somewhere under the stairs. Then, a beat later, "Rosa, if I die tonight, tell everyone I was thin." The absurdity of it nearly made me laugh in the middle of terror. Instead, I kept climbing. On the second landing, a man lunged from the dark. I hit him with the loose end of my broken chair tie because panic makes fools of us all, then ducked when he swung. He caught my shoulder anyway. Pain lit down my arm. I stumbled backward into the railing, and then the man dropped. Dante had shot him from the floor below. He looked up at me through the red emergency wash, and the sight of him hit like impact. Black coat gone, shirt open at the throat, blood at one sleeve that I prayed was not his. Face cut from concentration, and something far more dangerous beneath it. Relief and fear collided so hard inside me I forgot how breathing worked. "East exit," I shouted. He was already moving. Men came from the far catwalk. Dante took the stairs 3 at a time, Matteo's replacement team pushing in behind him. I didn't wait like a good hostage in a story. Gianni hadn't cut that tie for me to sit still and be saved prettily. The fire alarm controls hung on the wall by the 3rd floor maintenance door, a rusted box half open from some ancient repair. I yanked the panel down, saw the exposed timing wheel, and did the only thing I knew to do under pressure. I made the machine work for me, a hard twist, a jammed relay, a reset pulse. The alarm shifted from continuous hammer to staggered bursts. In the 3-second silence between bells, footsteps became audible. 2 men, left corridor, fast. "Left," I shouted. Dante turned and fired through the smoke before the attackers cleared the corner. They dropped. For one vicious second, the whole world narrowed to the fact that he had heard me and acted without question. When he reached the top landing, he didn't speak. He just crossed the space between us, put one hand at the back of my neck, and touched his forehead to mine like he needed proof in bone. Raw, wordless, desperate. Then he stepped back enough to look at me. "Can you run?" "Yes." "Good." That was as close to tenderness as war allowed. We made it 3 corridors before Vittorio's voice cut through the sirens from the floor below. "Dante?" Everything stopped inside me. I saw him then, through the gap in the railing. Vittorio standing in the open with one hand wrapped around Gianni's collar, a gun under the older man's jaw. Gianni's face was bloodless. His eyes found mine once. Shame, fear, something like relief. "You always were sentimental," Vittorio called up. "That's why Lucia died." The words hit Dante like a blow you could not see but felt anyway. The men behind us shifted, waiting. No one breathed wrong. Vittorio smiled that elegant dead smile. "He should have listened, so should your clockmaker." Dante went very still. I had begun to learn his silences. This was not restraint. This was the instant before something permanent. "Don't," I whispered. I don't know which of us I meant. Vittorio kept speaking, because cruel men believe talking is power. "Did she tell you her father begged? Old men always do when they realize principles don't stop pain." Rage moved through me so clean it felt cold. "No," I said. Both men looked up. I don't know what made my voice carry. Maybe fury has its own acoustics. "My father didn't beg. Yours taught you to mistake survival for greatness." The sentence bought exactly half a second. Long enough, Gianni moved. Not much, just enough to hit Vittorio's wrist offline before the gun fired. The shot took Gianni high in the chest instead of clean under the jaw. Dante fired once from the catwalk. Vittorio went down behind the crates. Chaos opened again. Dante was already on the stairs. I followed until he turned and barked my name with enough force to lock my knees. Stay, I stayed, not because I wanted to, because this was the kind of command built from terror, not dominance. Nico appeared beside me, breathless and streaked with soot, carrying a handgun like he resented every ounce of it. If anyone asks, he said, I was heroic and symmetrical. You're bleeding, he looked at his sleeve, rude of it. Below us, Dante reached Gianni first. The older man was alive, barely. He gripped Dante's forearm and said something I couldn't hear over the alarms. Dante bent close. Listened. His face changed in a way I had not seen before, shock stripped of all its armor. When he looked up at me, I knew before he spoke. Your father, he said, voice roughened to its raw materials, didn't die of his heart. I went cold from scalp to heel. Gianni coughed blood and forced out the rest loud enough for the catwalk to hear. Vittorio slowed the pills, looked natural. Your father knew Lucia saw the ledger, tried to get it out. Tried. My knees nearly gave. Vittorio had killed my father. Slowly, neatly, the way certain men set clocks back and call it maintenance. The warehouse lights surged once, twice, then died completely. In the dark that followed, men shouted Vittorio's name from the rear loading dock. Escape route. Dante rose, face emptied of everything but purpose. He looked at me once across the distance. I knew what that look meant now. Not stay safe, not be good, something far more frightening, wait for me. He vanished into the dark after his uncle. Nico touched my elbow lightly. That was romantic in the worst possible genre. I made a sound halfway to hysteria and clung to the railing because my legs had remembered grief all at once. The fire alarms cut out. In the sudden silence, every truth felt louder. My father had been murdered. Gianni had betrayed us and then bought back one moment with blood. And the man I loved had just gone after the only family he had left. I knew then that one of them would not come back unchanged. Maybe neither would. Chapter 10, The River Yard. He chose what he could not undo. They found Vittorio at the river. Of course they did. Men like him never fled toward daylight. They fled toward places that already smelled like rust, cold water, and old sin. The abandoned shipping yard on the South Branch belonged, on paper, to a shell company tied to the same church trust that had helped wash ledger money clean for 15 years. By dawn the city was a bruise-colored blur over the water, and we were moving again. Dante wanted me at the safe house. I went to the river yard anyway. This time I didn't sneak. I stood in the armory doorway while he loaded a magazine with hands that did not shake and said, I'm coming. No, yes, he looked up. It should be illegal, the effect that man had when he lifted his eyes fully to yours. Not because he was beautiful, though he was in the severe way carved things are. Because you felt weighed. Measured against a standard he never explained. This ends with bullets, he said. It started with clocks, I answered, and my father, a long pause. Then Matteo, pale but upright, stitched and furious in a dark overcoat over his hospital shirt, spoke from the hall. Take her, Dante turned. You should be in bed. I'm in pain. Not dead, Matteo looked at me, then back at Dante. And if you leave her behind now, she'll follow badly. That is true, Nico said, appearing with coffee in both hands and a bandage peeking from his collar. She has a history. Dante closed his eyes once like a man surrounded by burdens disguised as allies. Then he handed me a bulletproof vest. No victory speech. No permission, just that. The river yard spread in gray slats of steel and chain link under morning mist. Cranes stood motionless over stacks of containers. Water slapped the pilings with ugly patience. Somewhere a gull screamed like a bad omen. We moved through the maintenance offices first. Matteo with 2 men. Nico on comms, muttering to himself and to God in alternating turns. Dante at the front with me 1 pace behind, because that was the compromise he could live with and I could exploit. The flash drive from the warehouse had finally opened in the car. Nico, who described himself as emotionally technical, had gotten it decrypted with help from a very nervous young man over the phone. It held transaction logs, audio clips, and a schedule for payouts linked to judges, customs officers, cops, and one alderman who apparently liked cathedral restoration enough to launder murder money through stained glass grants. More importantly, it held proof Vittorio had authorized both the car bomb and the medication switch that killed my father. Proof mattered. In Dante's world, perhaps less than bullets, but enough. The first shooter appeared in the catwalk office window above us. Dante saw the reflection on the wet concrete before I did. He shoved me into the shelter of a rusted forklift and fired upward in one motion. Glass burst outward. The body followed a second later. My stomach lurched. I didn't look away. He checked me once with his eyes. Still whole, still breathing, then he moved. We crossed the yard in bursts. Container shadow to chain-link wall, office door to loading crane. Violence came in fast mathematical pieces. 2 men on the west platform, one by the fuel drums, another behind the generator shack. Dante and Matteo made decisions in lines of fire. I made them in smaller, stranger ways, spotting the control shed, remembering river yard cranes use manual lock pins older than their electrical systems. Realizing a hanging container could become a wall if its release jammed half-drop. Nico, I shouted into the comm, static. Then, if this is about my steps today, I refuse accountability. Can you cut power to crane 3 and cycle the brake? A beat. Probably. Why? Because I need it to stick halfway. Absolutely the kind of sentence that kills me. 3 seconds later, the crane shrieked overhead. The suspended container dropped 6 feet and locked crooked, slamming between Dante's line and the sniper on the east stack. The shot meant for Dante hit steel instead. He glanced up at the container. Then at me, surprised him. Good. We reached the main loading shed at the center of the yard just as a black sedan tore from behind the warehouse and skidded toward the gate. Vittorio's escape. Dante fired at the front tire. Matteo hit the rear quarter. The car swerved, clipped the gate post, and spun into a stack of empty oil drums. Silence followed. Brief. Terrible. Dante approached first. Vittorio stepped out with blood at his temple and one final gun in his hand. The older man laughed softly, looking from Dante to me as if he had expected this exact geometry all along. There she is, he said, the crack in the wall. Dante stopped 10 feet away. The resemblance between them was worst in stillness. Same jaw, same dark eyes, same ability to turn a room into waiting. But where Dante's control had edges worn by pain, Vittorio's was polished smooth by the absence of it. You killed Lucia, Dante said. No, Vittorio answered. I killed your illusion that family and weakness can coexist. The wind came off the river raw enough to sting my eyes. You killed my father, I said. Vittorio tilted his head. A necessary man. Uncooperative. Dante's face altered by 1 degree, enough to make every guard around us shift without meaning to. That was how fear worked around him, not because he roared, because he arrived. Vittorio saw it and smiled anyway. Do you think killing me changes what you are? You built yourself in my image after the bomb, boy. Efficient, unsentimental. You only hate me because I reached the end of your logic first. That was the mirror. There it was, not pure evil. Worse, recognition. For one horrible second, I saw that it was true enough to hurt. Dante had survived by becoming hard in some of the same places. The difference had never been bloodlessness. It had been restraint, choice, the fact that he still let pain cost him. Vittorio lifted his guns slightly toward me. Dante moved before thought. The first shot hit Dante high in the shoulder. He did not go down. The second went wild because he was already on Vittorio, driving him against the sedan hard enough to buckle the door. The gun flew. Men shouted. Matteo started forward and stopped when Dante threw out one arm without looking. No, this was his. Their struggle was fast and ugly and far more human than the polished violence Dante usually delivered. Family always is. Vittorio grabbed the knife from his coat. Dante caught his wrist. Steel flashed once between them. Blood hit the car hood. I didn't know whose until Vittorio gasped. Dante had taken the knife and buried it under his uncle's ribs with a motion so efficient it looked almost tender from a distance. Vittorio stared at him. For the first time, fear entered the older man's face, not because he was dying, because he finally understood the difference between them. Dante leaned close enough that only those nearest heard him. "I was near enough. You taught me to cut away what I loved first," he said, voice low and terrible. "She taught me not to." Then he stepped back and let Vittorio fall. No one moved. The river slapped the pilings. Somewhere metal clanged in the wind. The city kept existing, which felt insulting. Matteo gave the signal. Men fanned out. Weapons lowered. Calls began. Bodies checked. Evidence bagged. The practical work that follows every end, whether anyone is ready or not. I crossed the distance to Dante. Blood soaked the shoulder of his coat. His breathing was controlled, too controlled. Shock already being held at gunpoint by habit. "It's over," I said, because I needed someone too. He looked at me with eyes gone dark from depth. "Yes," he said, but when I pressed my hands to the wound to stop the bleeding, I felt the cost of it in the way he swayed exactly once and let me hold him up. Victory had not made him lighter. It had only made the burden his own at last. By evening, Gianni was dead. Matteo was stitched again and furious about being stitched at all. 2 of Dante's men had not come back from the river yard. Rosa lit candles in the kitchen without comment. Nico drank 3 espressos and announced he was retiring at 32 into a life of moderate crime and fewer staircases. And in the hospital room, while the city dimmed beyond the blinds, Dante sat on the bed edge with his arm bandaged and his head bowed just slightly, as if the posture cost him less than grief. I stood between his knees and touched his face. He closed his eyes. "It is over," I said again. This time he believed me enough to bleed. Chapter 11. The ring, he asked me like a man, not a king. War ends messily. That is one of the first lies stories tell you, that there is a clean moment when the danger stops, and everyone who survived finally learns how to breathe. Real endings come in paperwork, funerals, disinfectant, frozen casseroles no one remembers sending, lawyers suddenly honest under pressure. Cops suddenly interested when names higher than theirs enter the file. 3 weeks after the river yard, the city was still digesting the scandal Vittorio had hidden under charity galas and church trust signatures. Cops suddenly interested when names higher than theirs enter the file. 3 weeks after the river yard, men were still being arrested. One judge resigned before dawn and disappeared into a rehab clinic the newspapers called private treatment. 2 customs officers were found crying in separate federal buildings. An alderman suddenly discovered religion in public. Chicago kept pretending to be shocked by the existence of rot it had landscaped for years. Inside Dante's world, the accounting was quieter. Gianni was buried on a Wednesday under a sky the color of old silver. His son stood between his mother and the priest with a shaved head and a face too young for that kind of composure. I cried anyway, not because Gianni had been innocent, he hadn't, but because people are rarely one thing all the way through, and betrayal bought with a child's life is still betrayal and still tragedy and still, somehow, human. Dante stood beside me at the cemetery with his bandaged shoulder hidden under a black coat. He did not touch me. He did not need to. His presence felt like a wall at my back and a storm held in check by muscle. Men approached him in twos after the service, offering condolences, promises, reports. He listened to all of them with the same grave stillness, and sent them away with a nod or a sentence or nothing at all. When everyone else had drifted toward their cars, he stayed in front of Gianni's grave a moment longer. "I paid for his son's treatment," he said. The wind moved my veil against my cheek. "I know, he still sold you." "Yes." His ring tapped once against the bouquet in his hand. Metal, paper. A softened version of the same sound that had once made me open a door after midnight. "I should have seen it sooner," he said. There it was, not grief exactly, the sharper thing under it. Responsibility turned inward until it cut. I looked at the fresh earth. "If you had seen everything sooner, you wouldn't be human." His gaze came to me, tired, dark, unarmored for half a breath. "Some days that sounds efficient. I don't love you for efficiency." The words left before I could polish them into safety. He went very still. "So did I. There are confessions that feel glorious." That one didn't. It felt like stepping barefoot into cold water and realizing it was deeper than the shore suggested. Dante looked away first, not rejection, restraint. That old ruthless discipline turning itself against the one thing he wanted. "Come home," he said quietly. Home, not the safe house, not his house, not my apartment over the shattered shop. Home. It took me the whole drive back to understand what the word had done to me. The shop reopened in stages. New front glass, refinished shelves. Insurance money that appeared too quickly and asked too few questions, until I learned Matteo had turned 3 shell accounts into 1 legal settlement, with the kind of elegance that should probably have been prosecutable. He was back on his feet by then, stitched, thinner, and even drier than before. "Try not to bleed in here again," I told him when he carried in a crate of restored tools. He raised an eyebrow. "Your standards are oppressive." Nico came behind him with a hanging fern and 2 pastry boxes. "I brought emotional support cannoli." "You brought sugar," Matteo said. "Same thing." Rosa entered last, took one look at the fern, and announced it would die under his care because he watered plants like a man apologizing to them. Nico informed her he had depth. She informed him he had cheekbones and no discipline. He followed her into the back room carrying both pastry boxes and grinning like a man being insulted by his favorite hymn. That was the thing about survival. It didn't always arrive looking noble. Sometimes it looked like dust sheets coming off repaired shelves, like men arguing over receipts. Like Rosa setting soup on the upstairs stove before anyone asked whether I was staying late. I was. Dante came by at closing, never at the same hour, always after dark. Sometimes he brought files for Matteo, and used my workbench like an altar to controlled annoyance. Sometimes he said almost nothing, only stood by the window while I cleaned a movement or reset a spring. The room filling with the sound of ticking, and our mutual refusal to rush what had already changed. The first night he kissed me again, it happened because I reached for his tie. He had come straight from some meeting that had put cold weather into his face. The shop was closed. The front lights were dim. I was locking the display case when I noticed he had been standing too long in silence, one hand braced on the counter, shoulder tight under his coat. "You're bleeding," I said. "It's nothing. That usually means stitches." He almost smiled. Almost. I stepped close enough to loosen his tie, intending only that. My fingers brushed his throat. His hand came up and stopped at my waist without pressure, as if even now he was asking permission in the language he trusted most. "Little saint," he said, rough as low fire, "be careful." "With what?" His eyes dropped to my mouth and stayed there a dangerous second too long. "Me." I should have made a joke. I should have stepped back. Instead, I said the truest and most frightening thing available. "I think I stopped being careful a while ago." That was all it took. The kiss was not desperate like the rectory. It was slower, deeper, earned by grief and waiting and all the times he had stopped himself because I mattered more to him than wanting. He touched me like a man learning the shape of a prayer he did not deserve to say aloud. When he pulled away, his forehead rested against mine. "I can give you the institute," he said. "Florence. Money, distance, a clean life." I touched the bandage hidden under his collar. "Do you want to?" "No." "Then ask me the real thing." Something moved across his face then, not fear exactly. Dante did not fear many things in ways visible to other people, but this was close. This was a man who could order violence with one glance and still found himself shaken by the possibility of being chosen freely. He reached into his coat and took out a small velvet box. No performance, no kneeling in the sawdust of my shop, no king making a declaration, just a man with tired eyes and a ring in his hand. "My mother S," he said. I had it reset because the stone was cracked. His voice dropped lower. "Marry me, Alina, not because it redeems anything, not because it makes my world kinder than it is. Marry me because you know exactly what I am and you came back anyway." I looked at the ring, old gold, simple, stronger for having been repaired instead of replaced, like everything I trusted. "Yes," I whispered. The breath he let out sounded like it had been trapped in him for years. When he slid the ring onto my finger, his hand shook once. Just once. Then he lifted it to his mouth and kissed my knuckles as if reverence were harder for him than violence. Later, after Matteo had gone home and Nico had been dragged away from Rose's kitchen, by the threat of being fed a fourth plate of lasagna. Dante locked the shop and held the door open for me. No speeches, no crowd, no music, just his hand at the small of my back and the city breathing cold around us. I went home with him. Chapter 12, the door frame, he was holding it too tightly again 9 months later. The first sound he made at the workshop door was still the ring. Metal, wood, soft, precise. Once. I looked up from the bench before he opened it. Spring had come late that year. Chicago wore it carefully, like a city embarrassed by tenderness. The window over my work table was cracked open just enough to let in the smell of rain lifting off pavement, and the far-off garlicandiste drift from the bakery on the corner. Downstairs, Rossi Restoration had become two things at once. My father's old trade returned to honest life. And a front respectable enough that men in suits could come in through the back office to hand Matteo records they didn't want associated with their own names. Some worlds do not become clean, they become chosen. I had learned the difference. Dante stepped inside, broad shoulders filling the doorway for half a second before the light settled around him. Navy suit, no tie. The kind of exhaustion that came from meetings rather than gunfire, though in his life the two were cousins. He closed the door behind him and the ring touched the frame again, softer this time, an unconscious habit instead of a warning. My pulse still noticed. That was the problem, or the gift. "You're late," I said. I was detained. By men with guns or men with opinions, one led to the other. I smiled despite myself and bent back over the clock movement in my hand. It was a small marine chronometer, one of the museum donors had sent over. All brass weight and delicate stubbornness. Behind me, I heard him set something on the side table, take off his jacket, and exhale once as if he had been holding the whole day between his teeth. We lived upstairs now. My apartment had been expanded into the rooms beside it after Dante bought the building from the old landlord with the same expression other men used to buy coffee. Not a palace, not a fortress. A home arranged above a shop full of measured time. Rosa called it romantic in a practical way, which from her was basically a sonnet. Nico called it deeply inconvenient for my commute and also beautiful. Usually while eating the low-sugar pastries Rosa now claimed she made only because his doctor was tiresome. He still loved her hopelessly. She still pretended not to notice. Last Sunday she had packed him lemon ricotta cookies in a tin with his initials on the lid. He had stared at it for a full minute and then excused himself to process his victory with dignity. Matteo had recovered enough to resume making criminals sound like accountants and accountants. Sound like frightened schoolboys. He also came by every Thursday for espresso and whatever new pastry disaster Nico had begged Rosa to make health-conscious. We were, absurdly, a family, dangerous, scarred, occasionally armed. Still, I finished the adjustment and glanced over my shoulder. Dante stood by the nursery door across the hall. That room had once been my father's storage closet. Now the walls were painted a pale cream Rosa said hid dust and blessed sleep. A cradle stood near the window. On the shelf above it sat Lucia's watch under glass, ticking again, because some ghosts deserved rhythm instead of silence. Dante was holding the tiny silver rattle Rosa's sister had sent from Naples for our daughter's baptism next month. He was gripping it too hard. The realization hit me with such force that for a second I was no longer in the spring light of our rebuilt life. I was back in my apartment above the shop, a storm in the hall, a drunk, dangerous man with a gun in one hand and a broken watch in the other. I set down my tools and crossed the room. He watched me come with that same stillness he had always had, but now I knew what lived inside it. Not emptiness, cost, love, the endless work of remaining a man instead of a weapon. Without a word, I held out my hand. He looked at it, then at me. And there it was again, the bookend I had not known I was building when I first opened my door to him. "You're holding it too tightly," I said softly. His eyes changed. Not surprise, not anymore. Recognition deep enough to ache. He gave me the rattle. I turned it once in my fingers. "She's not going to break." "No," he said. His voice was low, worn thin at the edges. "But the world keeps trying." Our daughter stirred in the cradle, making the small, uncertain sounds of babies deciding whether sleep is a promise or a trick. She had his dark eyes and my mouth, and the kind of tiny, furious grip that suggested both family lines had contributed materially to her character. The first time Dante held her, he had looked almost insulted by how quickly fear moved in where certainty usually lived. Now he came to stand beside me and look down into the cradle. "Meeting?" I asked. He nodded once. "Bad?" "Yes." I didn't ask for details first. That was another thing love had taught me. Some wounds needed the body before the language. I put the rattle down, reached for his hand, and drew him toward the rocking chair in the corner. He let me. That alone would have startled the man he had been in chapter 1 of my life. I sat. He lowered himself to the footstool at my knees, one arm draped over my lap, his bandaged-free shoulder broad and warm under my palm. I combed my fingers through his hair until the hard line of his mouth eased. "She smiled today," I murmured. "At me?" "No, at the ceiling medallion." "You were a close second." He made a sound very close to a laugh. "Progress. Mateo says the West Side captains finally signed the new books," I added. "Nico says this proves fear works better than spreadsheets." "But only by a little." "Nico says many things." Nico also cried because Rosa packed him lunch in matching containers. Dante closed his eyes briefly. "I saw, that man will propose over soup if she keeps this up. She'll say no twice. And then she'll feed him." That got the laugh properly. Low, brief. Worth every war we had walked through to hear it. The baby made another small sound. Dante rose immediately and went to the cradle. All that calm, dangerous grace turned absurdly gentle. He bent over her, one hand braced on the rail, the other hovering first, as if asking permission even from someone too small to grant it, before touching her blanket. My chest tightened, not from fear. From memory, from the fact that he still did it, stopped himself first, chose tenderness like it cost him something and meant it anyway. He looked back at me then, and I saw he was thinking the same thing. The first night, the gun, the watch, my hand held out in a room that could have ended very differently. "Why me?" I asked before I could lose my nerve. He was quiet long enough that the clock on my bench ticked 7 times. Then he came back to me, knelt by the chair, and rested his forehead lightly against my knee. "Because you took death out of my hand," he said. "And then you worried about the watch." My throat closed around a laugh and a cry at the same time. He looked up. "Because you looked at me like I was a man holding something broken too tightly," he went on, "not a monster, and you still do." I touched his face. "You are a man holding many things too tightly." His mouth curved. "I know, little saint." There it was, not possession now, not observation, home. Later. After Rosa came up with soup we had not requested, and Nico followed carrying 3 tiny bibs for strategic options. And Mateo stopped in only long enough to drop off a folder and steal 2 biscuits. And the baby finally surrendered to sleep. Dante locked the nursery door halfway and stood with me in the hall. The apartment was quiet in the deep, ordinary way that had once seemed impossible. Dishes in the sink, a jacket over the banister, the soft ticking of restored clocks downstairs. His world had not become safe. Mine had not stayed clean. We had simply chosen each other inside the truth of that. He lifted my hand and pressed his lips to my ring. Then, as if he could not help himself, he touched his signet ring to the nursery doorframe. Metal, wood, soft, precise, the same sound that had once meant danger at my door. Now it meant he was home. I still don't know whether loving a man like Dante made me brave or only taught me which fears were worth keeping. Maybe that question never really closes. Maybe some endings are complete and still leave one quiet ache alive inside them. So tell me this. Would you have chosen Dante and let the clean life die, or would you have boarded the train?